Landlords are nervous. Starmer was appointed as Prime Minister on July the 5th, and Labour's already changing the landscape of the rental property market. Now, it's definitely hitting the main news media, with new policies coming across over the last few weeks. Now, in this video, I'm going to share with you 5 new policies that's going to impact you as a landlord, but I'm also going to share with you, as always, my opinion on the matter. Stay tuned. First up, let's talk about the Renters' Right Bill, which pretty much is Labour's version of the Conservatives' Renters' Reform Bill, which made a lot of noise over the course of the last 4 to 5 years. What I find bizarre is that Conservatives pretty much put in all the groundwork when it comes to this reform bill, which at the end of the day wasn't passed before the election. So effectively, Labour has picked up this old version of the bill, sprinkled a little bit more left policies on it, and seem to be pushing this through. What does it include? It increases tenants' rights and protections, gives them the right to request a pet, introduces the decent home standards into the private rental sector, and several other policies. And yet, the main point that landlords are concerned about is Section 21, which is the no-fault eviction. And the Conservative Party already had this in their plans, and yet they will try to be sensible with this because the court system is in absolute shambles, and to evict the tenant right now can take months, probably even years. And Labour came in and said, we're going to implement this within the first 100 days. They then changed their position, perhaps because the sort of situation a little bit more complex. I don't know, but it is something they want to bulldoze and want to implement pretty much as soon as possible. Would it happen this year? That remains to be seen. To put things into context, landlords don't just wake up one day and suddenly think, I'm going to evict my tenant and I'm going to serve them with Section 21. No, Section 21 is helpful in very specific situations. A typical story includes Jim. Now, Jim had a tenant for the first fixed period of the tenancy who was paying rent, and yet suddenly the tenant stopped paying. Now, the landlord, being empathetic, asked the tenant to provide some financial proof of perhaps they're having hardship, and yet the tenant refused. And given that the tenant wasn't willing to cooperate, the landlord decided to serve Section 8 and take the tenant to court. Now, throughout this process, it became apparent that the tenant was also subletting the property, which of course is a clear violation of the tenancy agreement. As the court date approached, the tenant suddenly decided to pay the rent in full, but continued to sublet the property. What that meant was that the landlord had to start the process all over again. So Jim came to me and said, Danny, if I had served Section 21, it would have been just a more straightforward process and I wouldn't have to have delayed with having this problematic tenant throughout a year and a half. As you can see, Section 21, the no-fault eviction, has its advantages for landlords. Now, if you are a landlord who are nervous about the abolishment of Section 21, leave me a comment below. Let me know what your thoughts are. On this same topic, Labour government plans to introduce hardship tests, which makes it even more difficult to evict tenants, according to a report by The Telegraph. The rule effectively bans evictions that's going to leave tenants worse off. Now, Housing Minister Matthew Pennycook says this rule is in place and aimed at reducing homelessness. But is this the responsibility of landlords or the government? If you're finding this video helpful, make sure you smash that like button. It really does motivate me in keeping up more of these videos. Matthew Pennycook says, the government does not support the introduction of rent controls. We have made it clear that we intend to use the Renters' Right Bill to provide tenants with greater protections against unreasonable within tenancy rent increases. Now, although there may not be rent controls, and that's sensible for them to do that, because if you've been following what's happened in Scotland, where they did introduce this rent control, it's been an absolute disaster. Rent have actually increased substantially, and I'm sure that's something that the government wants to avoid. Labour has made a statement before that they will bring an end to rental bidding wars, which of course has an impact on how much rental income landlords can achieve. Talking about government officials, we have Ed Miliband, who announces new interest in EPC targets for the private rental sector and says that landlords will need their properties to meet an EPC rating of C by 2030. So those landlords who thought that they dodged the bullet a few years ago when the Conservative government scrapped the minimum EPC can think again. And they're going to have to put their hands in the pocket to be able to meet this in the next few years. The fact that Labour is still announcing new policies absolutely means that you should subscribe to this channel so you keep up to date. Potential capital gain tax changes could cost landlords up to £11,000 if the capital gain tax system is changed to match income tax. According to an article, there could be a change in this tax system. Now, although not disclosed by Rachel Reeves' recent speech, it could be part of a bigger plan to fill in the huge $20 billion funding gap. Under the existing rules, basic taxpayers pay 18% capital gain, and yet those higher rate taxpayers will pay 24%. If capital gain tax was to be aligned with income tax, these figures would rise to 20% and 40% respectively. And this brings us into short-term let regulations. The government has had huge plans for this sector because they believe that this removes stock from the long let into the short let, and they want to balance this out. Some of the regulations for the short-term rental industry is going to include, but not exclusively, planning permission. New regulations will require planning permission for setting up new short-term rentals, allowing local authorities to control the number of short-term lets. And I'm sure there's also going to be a registration scheme for landlords, very similar to what we've seen in Scotland, whereby landlords who want to launch their properties into the short-term rental sector will need to register. Included in this is the end of holiday furnished lettings, which comes to an end next year in April 2025. If you want to dive in deep as to why the short-term rental boom is over, make sure you watch my video above and also on the link on the description. There you have it, 5 new policies that's going to impact you as a landlord. My opinion of the matter is that the markets always find a way to adjust itself. I'm going to see more professional and more corporations taking over the private rental sector, and unfortunately those smaller landlords are going to be pushed out. Why? Because those corporations have, number one, the resources, the money, and of course the team to be able to manage all of these regulations, but also to find a way to be more tax efficient, to be more viable in a buy-to-let market.